Collingwood's expressivism. Collingwood's version of expressivism is expressly based on both an admiration for Croce's aesthetic and an awareness of the defects to which everyday expressivism is prone. In the Principles of Art, he repudiates most of the features of the everyday version of expressivism. Art, in his view, is not concerned with the arousal of emotion at all. Indeed, he draws a sharp distinction between art proper and the use of art to arouse feelings and emotions. One instance of this is the use of art for purposes of amusement or entertainment, something already considered in Chapter 1. Another is the arousal of emotion with an eye to bringing about practical effects. Perhaps a little oddly, Collingwood calls this art as magic. The sort of thing he has in mind is the way that A.C. Benson's poem, Land of Hope and Glory, set to music by Elgar, is often used at political rallies to rouse patriotic feeling, though Collingwood's own example is not this but the poems of Rudyard Kipling. Neither of these is art proper because they use the media of art, paint, poetry, music, and so on, as means. Art can be used in this way, of course, in advertising and propaganda, for example. When it is reduced to a kind of technology or craft, a device for doing something else that need not be in any way artistic. If emotional stimulation is the sum of what art has to offer, art can be replaced by other forms of magic and amusement without significant loss. The value of a craft, a means to an end, resides entirely in its products, so that other means to the same end will do just as well. Computer graphics programs can replace cartographers, for example. So if the artists were craftsmen like cartographers, in principle they too could be dispensed with. It is a presupposition of Collingwood's philosophy of art that the nature and value of art has to be explained in a way that makes it of unique value. Without cartography, the world is a poorer place, only so long as there is not some other technique for producing good maps. Without art, the world would be a poorer place, and nothing could make good the loss. The simple version of expressivism, then, is mistaken in the emphasis it lays on emotional stimulation. This is just one important mistake. Another is its supposition that the relevant emotion is one that pre-exists the work of art and is to be found independently in the life of the artist. That is to say, Collingwood thinks it is wrong to imagine that a work of art is merely the translation into paint, music, or words of an emotional experience the artist has had before ever the work of creation has begun. According to Collingwood, the original emotion is nothing more than an indeterminate psychic disturbance. This indefinite experience is gradually identified and refined in the process of creating the work until the artist can recognize it as the emotion it is. An example might be a general uneasiness that is gradually identified as anger rather than, say, anxiety. It is also wrong to suppose that even this vague psychic disturbance must be temporarily prior to artistic activity. The activity of feeling and the activity of creating, though not identical, are connected in such a way that each is conditional upon the other, which is to say that neither can be isolated or identified without the other. In other words, we can only identify the emotion when it has come to realization through the work of art. Towards the end of the principles of art, Collingwood adapts to his own use the terminology of impressions and ideas made famous by David Hume. An impression is a sense experience of any kind: a sound, a sight, a smell. And an idea is a concept which has intellectual but not sensual content. According to Collingwood, each act of imagination has an impression or sensuous experience at its base, which by mental activity is converted into an idea. Every imaginative experience is a sensuous experience raised to the imaginative level by an act of consciousness. He means by this that the sensual and emotional experience contained in a work of art is not raw, felt experience, but experience mediated by the thought and imagination of the artist. A major objection to naive expressivism we saw is its inability to accommodate the importance of imagination. In Collingwood's aesthetic, by contrast, imagination plays a central role. In fact, art proper, as he describes it, has two equally important elements: expression and imagination. It is by imaginative construction that the artist transforms vague and uncertain emotion into an articulate expression. The process of artistic creation is thus not a matter of making external what already exists internally, which is how the simple model construes it, but a process of imaginative discovery. And since the psychic disturbance with which it begins is the artist's, art is a process of self-discovery. Herein, in fact, lies its peculiar value: self-knowledge. Art is not a luxury, and bad art is not a thing we can afford to tolerate. To know ourselves is the foundation of all life that develops beyond the mere physical level of experience. Every utterance and every gesture that each one of us makes is a work of art. It is important to each one of us that in making them, however much he deceives others, he should not deceive himself. If he deceives himself in this matter, he has sown in himself a seed which, unless he roots it up again, may grow into any kind of wickedness, any kind of mental disease, any kind of stupidity and folly and insanity. Bad art, the corrupt consciousness, is the true radix malorum, root of evil. This is a striking panegyric to the value of art and attributes very great importance to it. Two thoughts spring to mind, however. If every utterance and every gesture is a work of art, this, on the face of it, leaves art in the more restricted sense in which it is commonly understood, of no special interest or value. Anyone and everyone is an artist. Furthermore, if the end of art is self-knowledge, knowledge of our own emotional states, artistic creation seems to be of consequence only to its creator, and art becomes a form of introspection. The implication of both points is that we no longer seem to have any reason to devote special attention to a Leonardo or a Shakespeare. Their works are not unique expressions of emotion, and in any case, as such, they are primarily of value to the artists themselves. Both these inferences are natural, but nonetheless mistaken. Collingwood is aware that what his account of art and the artist may easily be construed in this way, and as a result, he devotes a whole chapter to the relation between artist and community. In it, he argues that It is not what I feel that the artist identifies and articulates, but what we feel. The artist's business is to express emotions, and the only emotions he can express are those which he feels, namely his own. If he attaches any importance to the judgment of his audience, it can only be because he thinks that the emotions he has tried to express are shared by his audience. In other words, he undertakes his artistic labor not as a personal effort on his own private behalf, but as a public labor on behalf of the community to which he belongs. To this extent, Collingwood shares Kant's supposition of a sensus communis, and it is for this reason that art is socially important. It is not merely artists, but the whole community of which they are a part that come to self-knowledge in their work. This is why art is the community's medicine for the worst disease of mind, the corruption of consciousness. Second, it is wrong to think that the work of art consists in a material object, a painting or a book. This is not because some works of art are not obviously material at all. A dance, for instance, though that is an important objection, but because, being acts of imagination, works of art must be recreated in the minds of their audience. This claim has sometimes been interpreted in rather startling ways, as though it implied that art is all in the mind. But Collingwood is making the point that since, for instance, the same poem can appear in many different books, and the same piece of music can be played at different times and on different instruments, the work of art cannot be identified with its physical manifestation. It can only be said to exist if it exists in the active apprehension of a work by an audience. Collingwood expressly rejects any conception of audience as passive spectator. Art is not contemplation, it is action. And the function of the audience is not a merely receptive one, but collaborative. This is one of the very few points in which he concurs with Gadamer, whose theory otherwise he must regard as mistaking art proper for art as amusement. Expression versus expressiveness. The principles of art advances beyond the commonplace version of expressivism. Even so, there is reason to inquire more closely into how far Collingwood really overcomes its defects. At least one of the objections set out earlier, the difficulty of attributing an emotion or even a set of emotions to many works in some forms of art, is no less an objection to Collingwood's theory, despite its sophistication. But let us leave that difficulty aside, because there are substantial objections to the Tolstoyan view which Collingwood's theory can be made to answer. It is clear, for instance, that his version of expressivism does not attribute to artists independent, identifiable emotional states of which their art is the expression. What it attributes, if anything, is an undifferentiated psychic disturbance. And we can only take an interest in this insofar as it is realized in the work of art. This is why Collingwood thinks art criticism must be centered on the work rather than the artist. Whereas the commonplace version invites us to scrutinize the artist's history and psychology. Collingwood is scathing about criticism that has been reduced to nothing more than grubbing around for historical tidbits about painters and poets. Still, if there is no way the emotion of an artist expressed in the work can be specified or even apprehended independently of that work, what reason is there to call the work an expression of emotion? Why reason back from the work to the artist's emotions at all? And if, with Collingwood, we acknowledge that we find in a work of art is wholly and entirely imaginative, why not conclude that the emotion presented to us is presented indifferently as to ownership? It is not anyone's, and hence not the artist's. This is the line of thought that leads the eminent English literary critic Helen Gardner, in a slightly different context, to reject similar reasoning about Shakespeare's religious beliefs. No other dramatist shows, I think, such imaginative response to the quintessentially Christian concept of forgiveness, or gives such memorable expression to it. But one cannot argue from this to any conclusion about Shakespeare's own religious beliefs. Shakespeare is our greatest poet of human nature, and all we can say is that if his play requires that a character should speak as a Christian, he enters imaginatively into Christian experience and feeling with characteristic understanding and sympathy. The point can be generalized. Emery Jones, another critic, writes, Shakespeare's wholehearted submission to the principle of rhetorical dialectic, his willingness to lend a voice of the utmost eloquence to every point of view, is his dramatic secret. It is worth observing that this a-personal view of poetic imagination is not open to refutation by appealing to the depth of the emotion to be found in a work. Depth of this sort can just as plausibly be construed as evidence of the imaginative power revealed in the work, as it can be taken to be evidence of the poets having sincerely felt the emotion in question. There's much to be said for making the imaginative treatment of emotion, rather than the personal expression of feeling, the hallmark of art, and it has important consequences for expressivism. Collingwood argues that a specific emotion cannot be attributed to the artist independently of the work, and that imaginative power is an indispensable part of the artist's endeavor. This implies that the artist's peculiar gift is not a special capacity to feel, but a special capacity to imagine. To accept this view of art, however, Collingwood must abandon an important element of expressivism, one to which he holds throughout, namely that the artist's business is to express emotions, and the only emotions he can express are those which he feels his own. In a similar fashion, the audience's emotional experience also ceases to be important once we examine Collingwood's expressivism closely. The everyday version, it will be recalled, holds that emotion is transmitted from artist to audience by being aroused in the audience. Collingwood argues vigorously that to try to arouse emotion through the medium of art is a profound mistake. Nevertheless, given that the artist's expression of emotion is itself an experience of emotion, and given further that the audience participation is a collaborative realization of that experience on the part of both artist and audience, it seems to follow that the artist's emotion is aroused in the audience. In order to avoid this apparently inevitable conclusion, Collingwood must argue that the audience's collaborative activity, like the artist's own, is wholly and entirely imaginative. It follows that what anyone actually feels on reading a poem or watching a play is as wholly irrelevant to a proper appreciation of it as the psychological history of the author. If imagination rather than feeling is what matters, it is as much a mistake to try to determine the merits of a work of art by audience reaction as it is to judge the work on the author's sincerity. To understand this point, we have to return to the distinction mentioned earlier between being an expression of and being expressive of. Some writers sympathetic to expressivism have argued that the errors in the everyday theory arise from a confusion between the two. Being an expression of emotion implies that there is someone whose expression it is. Being expressive of does not imply any possessor, either artist or audience. For instance, someone can cry, "ah," in pain. This is an expression. But being largely inarticulate is not expressive. Later, when the pain is gone, it might be described as climbing to a crescendo before the cry. This is expressive of the pain, but not an expression of it, since the pain is gone now. Holding this distinction clearly in mind, we can see that it is possible to apprehend the peculiar appropriateness of the manner in which an emotion is expressed by a work, without falling into any false psychologism about how the artist or the audience must feel. In short, art can be expressive of an emotion without being an expression of that emotion. A simple illustration of this point: those who write verses for birthday, sympathy, and other sorts of cards compose lines which are not an expression of what they themselves are feeling, but which are expressive of the relevant emotion to be called into use whenever anyone happens to have a use for them. The question now arises as to whether anything properly called expressivism can survive the drawing of this important distinction. Why is a work's being expressive of emotion something to be valued? Recall Collingwood's explanation of the value of art. In acting imaginatively upon emotion, we bring it into consciousness, discover thereby what our consciousness contains, and come to self-knowledge. Now, if the artist is not expressing emotion, but formulating expressive utterances or representations of it, and if the audience does not need to feel any of these emotions, but only appreciate their imaginative expression, the value of the work cannot consist in self-knowledge on the part of either artist or audience. Since the emotions represented are not our emotions, we come to no further knowledge of ourselves by apprehending them. But this still leaves unclear why we should give special attention to the artist's expressive utterances, and why value is to be attached to them. One response is to say that these are possible emotions with which we may empathize. This is certainly correct, but by implication, it divorces audience apprehension from emotion completely, because even where the work in question can indeed be said to be expressive of an emotion. It does not matter how the audience feels at all, but only what it comes to understand. Collingwood himself seems to make this move in places. He sometimes describes the activity of both artist and audience in the language of cognition rather than feeling. For instance, he imagines a right-minded painter declaring, "One paints a thing in order to see it, and only a person who paints well," he goes on to tell us, "can see well. And conversely, only a person who sees well can paint well." Seeing here refers not to sensation, but to awareness. It means noticing what you see. And further, this act of awareness includes the noticing of much that is not visual. On the face of it, this alternative analysis implies that the value of art lies not in its helping us to come to a proper apprehension of personal or even communal feeling, but in a greater awareness of the world around us. And this remains the obvious interpretation, even where, as in expressive representations, the world around us is the world of emotional experience. We might put the matter this way. The expressivist theory of art, at least in its commonplace version, holds that where a specific emotion can be assigned to a work of art, the work is an expression of that emotion, and appreciation of the work consists in feeling that emotion oneself. If now we say that the work is not an expression of, but rather is expressive of the emotion, appreciating would consist in being brought to a heightened awareness of that emotion. Being brought into a higher, heightened awareness of an emotion does not imply undergoing any elements of that emotion. For example, I may to date be unaware of the intensity of your jealousy until one day you hit upon an especially expressive word or gesture. Then I appreciate your jealousy, but I do not share any of it. The expressiveness of your gesture can make me aware of your emotional state without engendering any emotion whatever in me. It is equally possible, of course, that my being made aware of your feelings gives rise to an emotional response on my part, but any such emotion has only a causal connection with yours. My having the emotion is neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition of being made aware how you feel. Conversely, your gesture may arouse an emotion in me, fear perhaps, and yet I remain unaware of your true emotional state. What these various possibilities show is that the initially innocent substitution of being expressive of for being an expression of brings about the abandonment of expressivism. If the function of art is to heighten awareness, the special connection between art and emotion that all forms of expressivism try to articulate and maintain is broken. Art can heighten our awareness of many other things in human experience besides emotion. Collingwood would probably not deny this. His most extended discussion of a work of art is T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land. And what he says about it is instructive, for he sees Eliot as presenting us with a prophetic vision. This poem is not in the least amusing, nor is it in the least magical. The reader who expects it to be satire or an entertaining description of vices is as disappointed with it as the reader who expects it to be propaganda or an exhortation to get up and do something. To the annoyance of both parties, it contains no indictments and no proposals. To the amateurs of literature, brought up on the idea of poetry as a genteel amusement, the thing is an affront. To the little neo-Kiplings who think of poetry as an incitement to political virtue, it is even worse, for it describes an evil where no one and nothing is to blame, an evil not curable by shooting capitalists or destroying a social system, a disease which has so eaten into civilization that political remedies are about as useful as poulticing a cancer. In The Waste Land, Eliot shows what poetry can be. For the artist must prophesy not in the sense that he foretells things to come, but in the sense that he tells his audience, at risk of their displeasure, the secrets of their own hearts. What should concern us here is not the justice of Collingwood's estimate of Eliot's achievement, but the language he uses to make that estimate. Eliot is said to describe, not feel, the present evil, and to tell the audience, not express for it, the secrets of their hearts. This is the language of cognition, not emotion. Collingwood would claim that the world the artist describes and tells his audience about is the world as charged with emotion, and that talk of describing and prophesying is compatible with expressivism, provided we do not confuse consciousness and intellect. It is the intellect, in Collingwood's view, which orders and organizes the data of consciousness and establishes relations between them. But it is art which brings those data to consciousness in the first place by realizing the sensuous impact of experience in a form in which consciousness can grasp it. This is the fundamental function of language in Collingwood's theory. And that is why he regards every linguistic act as a work of art. The works for which the term art is usually reserved exercise this function to perfection, or at least to the highest degree. There are thus two kinds of truth: the truth of intellect and the truth of consciousness. Science, broadly understood, is concerned with the former. It is pure thought and has no experiential element. Art, on the other hand, is concerned with consciousness, because real experience is essential to it. We must actually hear music or see a play in person. It is not enough merely to be told about or even understand their structure or content. Collingwood struggles, it seems to me, with the relation between philosophy and poetry, and in the end appears to conclude that they are the same. Thus, art may indeed be said to describe, to tell, to prophesy, but since its concern is with the truth of consciousness, none of this removes it from the world of emotional experience, or so Collingwood contends. Two observations are pertinent here. First, if one is to speak of truth in art, some such distinction as Collingwood draws is needed. Because whatever we learn from artists is not what we learn from the laboratory. This is a subject that will be dealt with more fully in the next chapter on art and understanding. Second, at the same time, it is only a lingering loyalty to expressivism that causes Collingwood to go on speaking of emotion in the way he does. For emotion, at the end of his analysis, means nothing more than sensuous experience brought to consciousness. Even this formulation might be misleading, for the term sensuous is not to be understood as feeling or perceiving in any very restricted sense. It includes such things as feelings of anxiety or loneliness, and a sense of mystery or foreboding, and he allows that the bringing of an experience to consciousness, i.e., being made aware of it, is intimately tied to having that experience. Collingwood is here employing a notion of experience which is to be found in other philosophers, in the British idealist tradition. Now, to say that artists give voice to experience, where this is to be contrasted with scientific or other abstraction from experience, may well be correct. But to insist that this is emotional experience is to extend the idea of emotion until it loses its usefulness. Collingwood says the world of the artist is charged with emotion. He also says that the artist's province is sensuous experience brought to consciousness. He might as easily say that artists are concerned with the imaginative presentation of immediate experience rather than the construction of abstract reflections upon experience. This last formulation leaves out all mention of emotion and sensuousness. And if it does so without significant loss, this is proof that Collingwood's theory of art has been driven beyond expressivism. That there is no significant loss in describing art and the aesthetic in terms of imagination rather than feeling is shown by the following example. Consider this poem. I see his blood upon the rose, and in the stars the glory of his eyes. His body gleams amid eternal snows. His tears fall from the skies. All pathways by his feet are trod. His strong heart stirs the ever-beating sea. His crown of thorns is twined with every thorn. His cross is every tree. These are the first and last stanzas of the poem Christ in Creation by Joseph Plunkett, an Irish nationalist revolutionary executed by the British for his part in the Easter Uprising of 1916. A literary critic would no doubt find faults in this poem, though I have omitted the weakest verse, but it is one of the plainest examples I have found of a work which could be said to reveal a charged world. Another might be Salvador Dali's picture, Christ of St. John of the Cross, which could be thought of as a pictorial equivalent of Plunkett's poem. But what is either work charged with? The obvious answer is charged with religious significance in acknowledgement of important differences between science and the arts, we can agree that significance here cannot mean just what it means in the case of an experimental result or a statistical correlation that is said to be significant. To this degree, Collingwood is correct in supposing that the contents of mind fall into different kinds. But what does it add if we say charged with religious emotion? We could mean by this the kind of experience that leads people to talk in religious ways. Either this means no more than religious significance already says, or it refers us to a specific emotional state. Rudolf Otto's Mysterium Tremens, fear of the divine and awe in its presence, for instance. If we suppose that the poem is an expression of such a feeling, we face all the objections rehearsed against Tolstoy's expressivism. The poem itself gives us no evidence for supposing that Plunkett was in such an emotional state, or that we will or have to feel awe or dread in reading and appreciating it. What we get from the poem, whatever the state of mind in writing it, is an idea of how a Christian belief in the omnipresence of Christ can enter one's experience of the natural world. If this is conveyed, it is not by the transference of an emotional state, but by the point-by-point correlation between traditionally important features of Christ, his body and blood, for instance, and the features of the natural world. This is why the blood and the rose, the crown and the thorns, the cross and the tree are strong correlations, while the eyes and the stars and those in the omitted verse are weak. To call the world that Plunkett describes charged with religious emotion is harmless enough, provided we understand that this means nothing more than an invocation of the world of religion. It may be said, of course, that the poem ought to allow us not merely to observe that world, but to enter it imaginatively, and thereby in some measure come to understand it. This is correct, but the key words here are imagination and understanding, and the key question is, what kind of understanding is this? If with Collingwood we want to talk about a distinctive truth in art, we need to ask not how art stimulates emotion, but how it directs consciousness. This is to ask about art as a source of understanding, and it shows that feeling or emotion, ordinarily understood, has been left behind. So the next topic for us to consider is art as understanding. Summary. We have now explored 3 accounts of the value that is to be found in art in simpler and more sophisticated versions. It is true that works of art can give pleasure and can be valued precisely because they give pleasure. To value them solely for this purpose, however, is to give art no special status over other sources of pleasure and to rank its importance rather lower on the scale of human values than most writers on art are apt to do. The Kantian aesthetic is an advance on aesthetic hedonism because by taking beauty as its focal point, it identifies a pleasurable experience that seems to have some special relation to art and a more universal character than simple personal desire and satisfaction. Nevertheless, it too has difficulty in explicating the special value of art because it seems to accommodate anything to which the aesthetic attitude can be applied, and not just deliberately created artworks. Gadamer's adaptation of the Kantian aesthetic, that art is to be understood as a form of play, overcomes something of this difficulty. It not only explains the relation between artist and audience more plausibly, but makes possible the distinction between the serious and the light-hearted in art. Its drawback, however, is that it cannot explain the difference between art and play in the literal sense, i.e., sport. Its failure in this respect is chiefly important because there is a striking difference between all sport and some art. Namely, that art, unlike sport, can have content. It can be about something. Any theory of the value of art that cannot account for this important difference must be regarded to some degree as defective. The question of content led us on to expressivism, the idea that the content of art is emotion. A number of problems confront this contention. First, it is difficult to locate the expression of emotion in a relevant and plausible account of the relation between artist, work, and audience. Second, an emphasis on the artist's emotion robs artistic activity of what would seem to make it special, namely imagination. Third, there is nothing valuable in the expression or arousal of emotion for its own sake. Collingwood offers us a more sophisticated version of expressivism which has the great merit of avoiding what we might call psychologism, and which proves as good an explanation of the value of art as one could want. But on closer investigation, we saw that these advantages are won through an effective abandonment of the essentials of expressivism. What we end up with, if we follow Collingwood's theory to its logical conclusion, is an account of art as a distinctive way of understanding human experience. And this is the suggestion that is to be investigated in the chapter that follows.